Okay, hi everybody. All right, so we're gonna get started, but before we do, I have a few announcements to make. Um, First off, I'm going to be giving the third assignment. Remember, there's 3 assignments in this class. I've given you 2. The third assignment I'm going to be giving next class on Thursday, and that's going to be due the following Thursday, so the very last class. So make sure that you're either in class to get that assignment or check online. I'll post it on Canvas at some point after Thursday as well. So just make sure you get that. Okay. Secondly, so every now and then FIU has to be accredited by certain accreditation agencies. And in order to be accredited, we have to do certain things. One of those things we have to do is that in certain courses, we evaluate students' learning in those courses. So what that means is that for this course in particular, they're doing an assessment of student learning in this course. So what that means is they want you to fill out, I think it's like a short quiz basically in social psychology. I think that's what it is. And they want you to do that by the end of the semester. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you some extra credit points if you do this. This is going to be posted in Canvas. It's going to become available next Monday, so 6 days from now, and it's going to be available through the end of the week. I think it's a really quick test. It's not going to go to your grade in any way. Even if you answered every question wrong, it doesn't affect your grade whatsoever in this class. Okay, but if you take that quiz, and I think it should be relatively short, then I will give you extra credit points in the class. I think I'm going to give 3 extra credit points if you take that quiz between next Monday and the Friday. Okay, it's not available yet. It won't be visible until next week, but I just wanted to mention that to you now that you have that opportunity to earn some extra credit points. I'll mention this again on Thursday's class as well. Okay, and one more thing before we get started. I wanted to just briefly go over assignment 2 with you guys. Come on, there we go. So what I had you guys do, obviously, is take an IAT. Hold on one second here, guys. Okay. Okay, hold on. I've lost my mouse. Okay, well, I'll get it back later. What I had you guys do is take an implicit association test or 2 implicit association tests, and then I had you write up a brief paragraph about how the IAT measures implicit attitudes. So I wanted to just go over what the IAT is and how it measures implicit attitudes. Everyone's scores should be posted or are posted in Canvas right now, so you should be able to see your score on your assignment. So there's a number of IATs. I think there's 14 or 15 IATs you could have taken. I'm going to give you an example of an IAT that looks at people's implicit attitudes that they have for old and young people. Okay, and so the basic idea is that the first couple of rounds of the implicit association test, as you should know, are basically you warming up to the test. So what they'll do is they'll show you a series of words that are either positive or negative in valence, that are either good words or bad words, and you've got to categorize them as quickly as possible. That's kind of a warm-up round. And then for this specific test, where we're looking at old and young faces, they'll show you a series of old or young faces, and you've got to categorize those as quickly as possible as being either young or old. That's another warm-up round. Now, then what the IAT does is it has 2 critical trials. Okay? So in one trial, what it'll do is it'll intersperse pictures of faces, either old or young, and words that are either good or bad. And you've got to categorize them as quickly as possible under this system here. So according to this system, if you encounter either an old face or a bad word, you might use your left hand to categorize it. If it's a young face or a good word, use your right hand to categorize it. Okay? And then what it does is it has you do the exact same thing, except it switches this classification system up. So that in this case, now what it does is if it's an old face or a good word, you might use your left hand. Or if it's a young face or a bad word, you might use your right hand to categorize them as quickly as possible. Now, the logic of the IAT is this. If you have an association between 2 things in your head, like let's say that you have associations between old faces and bad words, okay, bad ideas. So in other words, if you've been exposed through culture, through society, through the media, through various messages, that being old is a bad thing and being young is a good thing, for instance, then you form these associations between old and bad and between young and good in your head. And so when you're faced with this sort of classification system here, this should be relatively natural to you because you already kind of categorize old and bad together and young and good together. And so you should tend to respond pretty quickly under this classification system. On the other hand, most people don't have associations or these automatic associations between old and good or between young and bad, at least in this culture, because we tend to think being old is a bad thing. We don't have associations between old and good or between young and bad. As a consequence, when you're making these sort of decisions and you're making these categorizations as quickly as possible, this should be a little bit more difficult for you because of your natural tendency to associate old and bad together. You've got to sort of override that natural tendency. As a consequence, most people tend to respond slower when old and good are paired together and when young and bad are paired together versus this system here, when old and bad are paired together and young and good are paired together. So what the IET does is it measures how long it takes you to make these classifications. And if you're faster when old and bad are grouped together than when old and good are grouped together, then that suggests you have an automatic link between old and bad in your head. That's what your implicit attitude is. And so if you took this IET and your results indicated that you have a, let's say, a preference for young versus old faces, then what it means is that the IET figured that you were faster in responding to this classification system than you were responding to this classification system. In other words, you have a stronger link between old and bad than you do between old and good. Okay. Now, as I tried to allude to last week, this does not mean that you explicitly believe that young people are better than old people. Okay. It only means that you have grown up within a culture, within a society that has emphasized those associations. You've been exposed to those associations. Every time you hear someone complain that they're getting older, for instance, that's strengthening the association that being old is a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you believe old people are worse than young people. It just means that you've been exposed to that message culturally via the media, et cetera. Okay, so that's all that your IET results indicate. So if you recall last class when we talked about this two-step process to stereotyping, the first step was that perceiving a member of a stereotyped group automatically triggers thoughts of that stereotype. That's what the IET is getting at, that if you're exposed to an old person, because of that automatic association that we have in our heads, because we've been exposed to these messages, that should automatically trigger these sort of bad ideas, even though we don't necessarily explicitly believe them, okay? So in order to get full points on this assignment, you had to have indicated that the IAT measures implicit attitudes by measuring reaction time or response speed or how quickly you make these categorizations, something like that. And it compares them under these two classification systems. Okay, so it's comparing two different response times. You had to have said that to get 10 points. A lot of people didn't quite say that, or they said something like it looked at how many mistakes people made or something like that, which isn't really true. It's looking at reaction times. So if you didn't say that it measures reaction times and it compares them, then you probably got 8 points or something like that on the assignment, okay? I should also say, because this was brought up last class, someone mentioned that, well, that you get used to the first system that you're exposed to, and that makes it harder to respond to the second system. And that's true, and that's why for half of the people who took this test, half of them got old and bad first, and young and good, and the other half got this one first, got old and good first and young and bad first, and then the other one second, okay? So it sort of counterbalances the order in which you get those. And so therefore, across a number of participants, it cancels out the order that you got. Question is, what if you're neutral? Does that indicate a lack of implicit bias? Yeah, so if it showed that if your test said something like you show no preference for old or young faces, then that means you responded approximately as quickly under both classification systems, which would suggest that you don't really have strong implicit attitudes one way or the other. They are basically neutral. And so the same logic applies whether you took a race IAT or or any other IAT that's up there. The same logic applies. It's measuring your reaction speeds. Okay. With that out of the way, we have one slide left to cover in this section, then we'll move on to talk about aggressions. Let's just talk about this quickly. Okay, the last class we ended up talking about, two theories of prejudice. We looked at realistic conflict theory and social identity theory. These are basically theories of why people engage in prejudiced behavior. So make sure you know those for the exam. And I just want to talk about one other sort of interesting phenomenon that explains why prejudice exists, how it can be maintained over time. And in response to chat, yes, we will be having a quiz today at the end of class. And this is one of the reasons why prejudice can be maintained over time is due to what's known as belief in a just world. I want to explain quickly what that is. There's a tendency that we have, at least within this culture, there's a tendency that people sort of have at some level that the world is generally fair, meaning if someone does something good, they'll be rewarded for it. If someone does something bad, they will be punished for it later on. Again, it's not necessarily an explicit belief that we have, but as we'll see, there are psychological reasons why we want to believe that the world is fair. And this is captured in the idea of like karma, for instance. Karma, the idea that good things will happen to you if you do good, or bad things will happen to you if you do bad, right? Or if you've ever said something like, everything happens for a reason. That phrase is capturing this natural intrinsic belief that we have that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And so we can define belief in a just world, this belief that people have, like this: the tendency to believe that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Okay? Therefore, the world will end up being fair in the long run. And there are numerous reasons why we believe this, but mostly it's because it's psychologically satisfying, in a sense, to think that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. Because after all, we've seen in this class that we really think highly of ourselves. It's one of the main themes that runs through social psychology, right? That people think highly of themselves. And therefore, if I think I'm a good person and bad things only happen to bad people, then that means that I don't have to worry about bad things happening to me because I'm a good person, right? So because of that, we have this psychological need almost to consider the world fair, because that way I don't have to be threatened that bad things will happen to me. Right? In other words, we don't want to think that our fate is dependent on chance outcomes. So if you take something like cancer, for instance, it's very threatening, psychologically speaking, to think that any of us could get cancer at any time, right? That's kind of scary for us to consider, right? We don't want to think that whether we get cancer is based on just random chance, because then we can't really control it. We'd like to have a feeling of control. But if, on the other hand, we believe that the world is fair and just and bad things only happen to bad people, well, that means that cancer only happens to bad people. And because I'm not a bad person, I don't have to worry about getting cancer, therefore. So this tendency to believe the world is fair, or that bad things only happen to bad people, stems from this psychological need that we have to feel safe and secure and in control of our own outcomes later on. The problem is that this leads to blaming the victim. Because if we believe that bad things only happen to bad people, then therefore, if a bad thing happens to someone, they must have done something to deserve it. That's what we have this psychological tendency to believe, right? Because that's the only way we can maintain our belief that the world is actually fair. So as a consequence, we see all sorts of examples where people blame victims for their own misfortune, which is rather unfortunate. We see this in experimental settings. So there have been a number of studies where participants they're participating with another person, another participant, or at least someone they think is a participant. And that person is randomly selected among the two of them to receive some electric shocks. And so you have to watch your partner basically receive electric shocks. Now, in fact, there's no actual electric shocks. No one's actually receiving shocks, but you believe that they're receiving shocks. And what happens is that once you observe them receiving electric shocks, if you then rate that person, you tend to rate them lower than if they never received shocks in the first place. And the reason you do so is because we feel a need to feel like the world is fair, that bad things don't happen to good people. And therefore, if this person's getting shocked, they must have done something to deserve it. That way, I don't have to feel threatened that the same sort of thing might happen to me in the future. But of course, we see this outside of experimental lab settings as well. We see it in the real world. We see this all the time with rape victims in particular. Okay? where after a woman gets raped, then people will tend to blame her. What did you do to make that person rape you, or something like that, right? Now, of course, that's nonsense, and the only person to blame for a rape is the rapist themselves. But there's this tendency that people have to want to blame the rape victim, because if we acknowledge that bad, horrific things like rape can happen to good people, then what that means is those things might happen to me. And I don't want to think that that's a possibility of happening to me. So to avoid that uncomfortable feeling, I can convince myself the world is fair. And if the world is fair, therefore, victims must have done something to deserve it. And we see this in other contexts as well, like battered spouses and homeless people and things like that, where we have a tendency to think poorly of them at times, because that can maintain this belief that the world is fair. Okay. This is kind of similar in a sense to the fundamental attribution error. Remember, the fundamental attribution error is to attribute other people's behavior to their personality. And it's kind of similar to that, because if we can say that these rape victims or battered spouses or homeless people, something about them is what led to their victimhood, if we attribute that outcome to their personality, it's kind of like the fundamental attribution error. But the one difference is that belief in a just world, or blaming the victim, only occurs when we feel threatened. In other words, it only occurs when we feel like those negative outcomes could happen to us. And so we blame the victim to get rid of that feeling that these negative outcomes could happen to us. Okay? As a consequence, this stigmatism or this prejudice that we might have towards, let's say, the homeless, can maintain itself because of this belief in a just world that we have to maintain this sort of status quo. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about that section. And we're going to move on to a new topic. We've only got 2 topics left now. So we're going to talk about aggression for the rest of this week. And again, as I mentioned last week, I think, we're at the end of the semester, we're focused on topics that social psychologists have studied, that they've studied in order to try to improve the world, right? There's applied implications to this. So just like we saw that social psychologists study stereotyping and prejudice in part in order to reduce stereotyping and prejudice in the real world, we're also going to see that for aggression. That they have studied aggression for many, many decades, because the ultimate goal they might have is to reduce instances of aggression in the real world. So we'll just keep that in mind. Also, if you remember at the beginning of the semester, when we were talking about research methodology, we talked about operational definitions and the importance of operational definitions. So just to remind you, this is when we're studying some sort of ambiguous concept. And in order to make sure we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about when we're talking about that concept, we come up with an operational definition. We define a concept in terms of concrete behaviors. And that is certainly true when we look at aggression. And the reason for this is because your definition of aggression might differ from my personal definition of aggression, right? And so if I do research on aggression, I need to make sure that you understand what I mean when I talk about aggression. So to make sure we're all on the same page, social psychologists have certain operational definitions that they use for concepts like aggression. And that's what I want to show to you now. So here's a typical operational definition for aggression that social psychologists use. Any form of behavior directed toward the goal of harming or injuring another living being who is motivated to avoid such treatment. And as you're going to see, there are certain key components to this definition that are required for this definition for reasons that you will see. But let me point out these 4 key components of this definition. First off, when we are talking about aggression in social psychology, we are specifically referring to behaviors. Now, what that means is that if you have an aggressive thought, if you think about punching someone, for instance, or you have an aggressive dream, we're not going to count that as actual instances of aggression. And the reason for this is because social psychologists, as I mentioned a minute ago, are concerned with reducing actual instances of physical, or I should say, actual instances of real aggression in the real world. And so if someone has an aggressive thought and no one's actually harmed by that, it doesn't really matter to us. We're really concerned with behaviors that actually harm other people, right? And so we're only going to focus ourselves on behaviors and not thoughts or dreams or something like that. Second key component of this definition is that it's goal-oriented, meaning the person who's committing the aggressive behavior is trying to harm someone else. So if, for instance, I am playing basketball and while I'm playing, I accidentally elbow someone, we're not going to count that as an instance of aggression because I didn't mean to do it. It wasn't goal. There was no goal to harm anyone else, right? And again, we're interested in reducing aggression in the real world that we can actually reduce, the purposeful instances of aggression. So that's why we're interested in only this goal-directed behavior to harm people. A third component of this definition is that this aggressive behavior is aimed at a living being. It could be a human, it could be an animal, but it has to be aimed at a living being. So for instance, if I'm by myself and I get really frustrated and I punch my wall, we're not going to count that as aggression. And the reason being because there's no living being that's actually being harmed by my behavior. Now, if I punch someone else's wall or I punched a wall in order to intimidate someone, so there is someone that's being harmed by that behavior, that would count as aggression. But if I'm just by myself and I just punch a wall, that's not going to count as aggression because there's no actual person or actual living being who is being harmed by that behavior. And finally, the fourth component of aggression is that the person that's being aggressed against, that's on the receiving end of that aggression, has to be motivated to avoid that treatment. In other words, they have to not want that behavior to have happened to them. Okay? It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that they're aware that the behavior is going to occur. So you can imagine in a war scenario, for instance, if you've got a sniper who shoots and kills someone, that person might have never have been aware that the sniper was there, right? But had they been aware, they would have been motivated to avoid that treatment. They don't want to have been shot. Okay? And the reason that this part is in the definition is because there are some instances, some examples where people want that aggression to have occurred to them. So for instance, I always think of the movie Fight Club, if you've seen that. And in that movie, at one point, Brad Pitt's character asks Edward Norton's character to punch him in the face. He wants to be punched in the face, in other words. And when he punches them in the face, that doesn't count as aggression because he wanted it to happen to him. And again, this is because we are interested in instances of real world aggression where people are aggressed against it, where they don't want it to happen to them. That's the type of aggression we're interested in social psychology. Okay. So what that means is that if you're ever faced with a situation where it's unclear as to whether it counts as aggression or not, then what you do is you go through this checklist and you ask yourself, in this hypothetical situation, was it a behavior? Was there a goal to harm? Was it against a living being? Were they motivated to avoid it? If you answer yes to each of those components, then that's going to mean that we're going to call that aggression. If you answer no to any of those components, then it doesn't count as aggression. And so, just to make sure that we're on the same page with this, what I'm going to do is give you examples, some of which are examples of aggression and some of which are not examples of aggression. And I want you to tell me if you think these are examples of aggression. And you're going to do so by comparing this example to those four components. Okay, so imagine this. So imagine a hitman kills an unfaithful husband for the unreasonably low price of $1,000. And the question is this an example of aggression or not, according to our operational definitions? I'll give you a second if you want to write in the chat what you think on this. I see pretty much everyone is saying yes. Okay. So, and the way that we answer this, of course, is we're going to go through our four components. So we're going to say, is this a behavior? Well, yeah, killing someone is a behavior. Is there a goal to harm? Well, yeah, the hitman's trying to harm someone else. Is it against a living being? Well, yeah, the husband is a living being. Is that husband motivated to avoid that treatment? Yeah, presumably the husband doesn't want to be killed, so that would work. Okay. And so, because you answered yes to each of those four components, we're going to say yes, this is aggression. A jealous man kills his wife and lover. Is that aggression or not aggression? I see lots of yeses again. Okay, I think it's another relatively obvious one. So is it a behavior? Yeah, killing his wife and lover, that's a behavior. Is there a goal to harm them? Yep, he tried to kill them, sure. Is it against a living being? Yep, they're living beings. Are those living beings motivated to avoid that treatment? Yeah, they don't want to be killed. So that would count as aggression as well. Okay, so those are relatively straightforward. Now, as we're going to see, there is a difference between these two examples. the motivation for killing is a little bit different. They're both, in both cases, the hitman and the jealous man are both trying to kill someone, but their motivation's a little different. In the first case, they're only killing in order to get something else, in order to get money. In the second case, they're killing them because they're angry at them. And we're going to see that those are two different types of aggression later on, but in just a few minutes, but they both do count as examples of aggression. All right, let's look at number 3. Okay, I'm getting a message. Are you guys able to see my screen right now? Everyone can see the whole screen? Okay. All right, it looks like there might just be one student having an issue then. All right, let's look at example number 3. A prison ward executes a criminal. Does that count as aggression or not? So it gives someone the death penalty. Does that count as aggression or not? Okay, I'm seeing lots of no's this time. Oh, I got one yes. Okay, well, let's go through our operational definition, right? All right, so imagine that by executing, let's say you put him in the electric chair or lethal injection or whatever. Okay, so is that a behavior? Yeah, that's a behavior, right? Is there a motivation or a goal to harm the criminal? Well, yeah, they're trying to kill him. So yeah, that's motivation to harm them. Is the criminal a living being? Well, yeah, that's a human. Is that living being motivated to avoid that treatment? In other words, do they want to die? Probably not. There are some rare circumstances where they might want to be executed, but for the most part, they're probably not. So they are motivated to avoid that treatment. Because you answered yes to each of those 4 components, that forces you to say, yes, this is an example of aggression. Okay. So this is why we use operational definitions, because what you can see is that a lot of people's intuition as to what counts as aggression doesn't necessarily match up, right? So this would count as an example of aggression. Let's look at another one. A depressed person commits suicide. Does that count as an act of aggression? Got a no here. I've got mostly no's, one yes here. Okay. Well, again, let's go through our 4 components. Is it a behavior to commit suicide? Yep. Is there a goal to harm? Yep. Killing yourself, there's a goal to harm yourself. Is it against a living being? Yep. It's against the person who's committing suicide. Is that person motivated to avoid it? No, they're not motivated to avoid it. They're trying to impose that aggression on themselves. Because you answer no to that last component, that means this does not count as aggression. A man mentally rehearses a murder, aggression or not? Okay, I got some no's, I got some yeses. Okay, well, go through our 4 components. Is it a behavior? No, it's not a behavior right off the bat, right? Mentally rehearsing something in your head is not actually doing anything in the real world, right? So as long as you're only mentally rehearsing it, it does not count as aggression. Obviously, if you go through with it and actually commit murder, that is a behavior and that would count as aggression. But if it's only a thought and a mental rehearsal, it does not count as aggression. Yeah. There's a bunch of tricky examples of this. Yeah, because it's in his imagination. No one's actually being harmed, right? If you're mentally rehearsing a murder, no one has been harmed just by that. So because there's no action. So it's not going to be aggression. A hunter kills an animal for a trophy. Is that aggression or not? And I got a bunch of yeses. Okay. Well, let's see. Is it a behavior? Yeah, killing an animal is a behavior. Is there a motivation to harm? Yeah, the hunter's trying to kill the animal. Is it against a living being? An animal counts as a living being. Is that animal motivated to avoid it? Now, obviously, they don't know they're being hunted necessarily, but they don't want to be killed. They would try to avoid it if they knew so, if they knew that. So you would answer yes to that. You answer yes to every component. That counts as aggression. Girl Scout tries to help an elderly woman cross the street but trips her by accident. Aggression or not aggression? No, and I get lots of no's here. Okay, so why not? Let's see. Is it behavior? Yep. Is there a goal to harm? No, obviously not. If the Girl Scout trips an elderly woman by accident, there's no goal to harm, therefore it does not count as aggression. A person punches a hole in the wall in anger. I gave you this example a minute ago, right? So for the most part, this will be no, but there are some exceptions. So let's see. Why is this not count as aggression? Well, I assume you guys know because I mentioned it a minute ago. It's not against a living being, right? If you just punch a hole in the wall in anger, there's no one that's actually being harmed, and therefore it doesn't count as aggression. The exceptions to this would be if you punched a hole in the wall in order to scare someone, that would count as aggression because now you're attempting to scare them emotionally, right? So there is a living being who's being harmed there. But for the most part, if it's just because when you're by yourself and you're not trying to scare anyone else, then it would not count as aggression. One person calls another a racial slur. Okay, so mostly yeses here. So let's see. Well, is it a behavior? Yeah, that's a behavior. Calling someone a name is a behavior. Is there a motivation to harm that person? Yeah, you're not trying to harm them physically, but you're trying to harm them emotionally or mentally. That still counts. There's nothing in the operational definition that says that aggression has to be physical in nature. That's a key here. And so if you're trying to harm them emotionally, that would still count. Is it against a living being? Yep, it's against a living being. Is that living being motivated to avoid it? Yeah, they don't want to be called that name. So yes, they're motivated to avoid it. So yes, it meets all four of those components, and therefore we're going to call it an act of aggression. Okay? So remember that operational definition doesn't say that the aggression has to be physical. As long as there's an attempt to harm someone in any way, emotionally, mentally, physically, whatever, that all counts. What's that? Right, 5, yeah, 5 does not count, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, if it's in your own head, it doesn't count as aggression. If you're trying to harm someone mentally, it does count as aggression, right? Number 10, a person slams a door shut after an argument. Is that aggression or not? A bunch of mixed responses here. Technically, probably I didn't give you enough information to tell. That's probably why there's a bunch of different responses, right? Because if you look, first off, is it a behavior? Yep, slamming a door shut's behavior. Is there a motivation to harm? That's sort of unclear. It depends. If you just slammed a door shut because you were frustrated, then there's not a motivation to harm. If you're slamming a door shut in order to scare the other person, then there is a motivation to harm. So that's what this sort of all hinges on. So technically in this situation, you need a bit more information to know if this is an act of aggression. It completely depends on your motivation for slamming the door shut. But if you are doing it to scare someone, it would be against a living being who's motivated to avoid it. So therefore it would count as aggression. Number 11, Bob tries to shoot Rick, but misses and hits Tom instead. Is that aggression or not aggression? Well, Claudia, you got the right answer. The only one who got the right answer. This is actually a little tricky because there are two different acts and you've got to analyze each one separately. First off, we've got Bob trying to shoot Rick and missing. Okay, so first off, let's analyze that situation. So Bob tries to shoot Rick but misses. So is it a behavior? Yeah, shooting Rick is a behavior, right? Is there a motivation to harm? Well, yeah, he's trying to harm Rick. Is Rick a living being? Of course, Rick's a living being. Is Rick motivated to avoid it? Yeah, he's motivated to avoid it. Therefore, you answered yes to all four components. Bob's act against Rick is an act of aggression. He tried to harm him. Now, note that in our operational definition, there's nothing that says that the attempt to harm someone has to succeed, right? So even if you try to shoot Rick, maybe Rick doesn't even know you tried to shoot him, right? You could have tried to shoot him and missed, and Rick never knew you tried to shoot him to begin with. That would still count as an act of aggression because you attempted to harm him, right? But now if you analyze Bob's behavior against Tom, so Bob accidentally shoots Tom. Well, is that a behavior? Yes. Is there a goal to harm Tom? No, it was an accident, right? So it's not an act of aggression against Tom. So keep in mind that the outcome of the behavior doesn't matter, right? What matters is the attempt, the motivation to harm. So even though Bob doesn't actually harm Rick, it's an act of aggression against Rick because he tried to harm Rick. And even though Bob actually harmed Tom, it's not an act of aggression against Tom because he didn't mean to harm Tom. So it's yes to Rick and no to Tom. So yeah, because there's two different things that happen here, right? There's two different people that are affected by his behaviors. You have to analyze them separately. Without his motivation to harm, Bob wouldn't have tried shooting anyone. Yeah, that's true. But the point is the motivation was only against Rick and not against Tom. So the answer is yes and no. Okay. A couple other, I guess, distinctions I want to make that social psychologists make when they talk about aggression. One distinction is between what's known as hostile aggression and what's known as instrumental aggression. So hostile aggression is the aggression we engage in typically when we're mad at someone and we harm them, and the goal is to harm them, right? So the aggression is an end in and of itself. The point is the aggression. So you're mad at someone, you punch someone in the face because you want to hurt them. That's an example of hostile aggression. This is sometimes called hot aggression. When we use the word hot in social psychology, it usually means infused with emotion or motivation. And so in this case, hostile aggression typically is when someone's mad at someone, right? And they're trying to harm them. So that's why it's called hot aggression. In contrast to hostile aggression is what's known as instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression occurs when someone uses aggression not for the aggression itself, but they're using aggression in order to get something else. So we talked about in the first couple of examples that on the last slide, the first example was a hitman kills someone for $1,000, right? Well, the hitman is killing this person not because they hate that person, but because by killing them, they get money, right? There's some other reason why they're using aggression. In the second example I gave you, I said that a jealous man kills his wife and lover, right? Well, in that case, the aggression is the end in and of itself. He's trying to harm those people. And so that would be an example of hostile aggression. A hitman would be an example of instrumental aggression, using aggression for some other end. This is sometimes called cool or cold aggression, because in contrast to hostile aggression, which is sort of emotion-filled, instrumental aggression is often sort of cold aggression, because if you think of the hitman doesn't hate this person that they're killing. They're just doing it for money. There's not really emotion involved with that act. Therefore, it's cold or cool aggression. Now, behaviors don't have to be one or the other. They could be both. So for instance, let's say you take like an American soldier who is held hostage. Let's say at wartime, they're taken as a prisoner of war and held hostage and killed, let's say. In that case, oftentimes let's say a terrorist is the one that captures this person. The terrorist kills the American soldier. Well, in that case, they might be killing the American soldier in order to get America to withdraw its troops from their country or something, right? So they're using aggression as a means to get something else. So that makes it instrumental. At the same time, if the terrorist actually hates Americans, then there's also a hostile aggression component of it as well, where they also want to inflict harm on the American soldier. So that behavior can be both hostile and instrumental at the same time. So like killing an animal, well, if you're hunting, then you're killing an animal, let's say for a trophy or for meat, if you're going to eat it later on, you're killing it for some other reason. That would be instrumental. If you kill an animal because you hate bunnies or something, that would be an example of hostile aggression, but hopefully people don't hate bunnies. Okay. Or if you take a look at, let's say, a boxing match, right? Usually in a boxing match, the aggression, and certainly boxing would count as aggression, it would meet all four components of our definition. That aggression usually would be instrumental because you're usually inflicting damage or trying to harm the other person in order to win the fight, right? So you're using aggression to do something else to win the fight. But if the two boxers truly do hate each other and truly want to inflict damage on the other person, it can also be an example of hostile aggression. Or if you are this kitten and you're hired to kill dogs, again, if you're being hired and paid for it, it's instrumental. But if, as a kitten, you hate these German Shepherds, it could also be hostile aggression as well. Okay, so that's one distinction that we draw in social psychology between hostile and instrumental aggression, in part because the ways of reducing hostile aggression are different than the ways of reducing instrumental aggression. You've got different strategies to do so. We also want to make a distinction between what's called physical aggression, which is the aggression we normally think of, right? That's hitting, punching, kicking, anything that's physical in nature. We often make a distinction between that sort of physical aggression and what's called relational aggression. Relational aggression occurs when you're not harming someone physically, but you're harming their relationships with other people. That could be like damaging their status or their reputation. So for instance, gossiping about someone else, spreading rumors, giving someone the silent treatment. All of these things count as aggression. They all meet that definition, right? So if, for instance, let's say in high school or something, and you gave someone the silent treatment because you were mad at them, well, that's a behavior. You've got a motivation to harm them, to make them feel bad. It's against a living being, and that person's motivated to avoid it, right? It meets all parts of that definition. So that counts as aggression. It's obviously not physical aggression. It's relational aggression. Okay, so relational aggression is particularly prevalent among like preteens and teenagers, like in grade school, junior high, high school, that sort of thing. Becomes less prevalent among older people, but still somewhat prevalent. Yeah, it can be kind of like a passive aggressive behavior to some extent. Okay. One question that not only psychologists, but philosophers and theologians and all sorts of people throughout the ages have had is the following. Is aggression a biological behavior or a learned behavior? In other words, are we born with a tendency to aggress, or do we learn how to aggress? And lots of people have grappled with this question. And yeah, in general, in psychology, if you ask, is a behavior biological or learned, it's almost always both, almost always. Not quite always, but almost always. And that's certainly true for aggression, as we're going to see. But the question here, and sometimes people have phrased this in terms of this, is whether humans are what are called noble savages. You can think of a savage, the way that they mean it in this phrase is a savage is someone who hasn't been exposed to culture or society, someone who grew up in a jungle, for instance, okay? And so a noble savage would mean if you've grown up outside of society, outside of culture, noble is a good thing. It's being a good person, right? So a noble savage would imply that if you're not exposed to culture and society, if you don't learn it, then you're going to naturally tend to be good, okay? So the perspective that humans are noble savages implies that perspective means that people think that aggression is something that is learned, but we're not inherently naturally aggressive. So the two different perspectives can be summed up the following way. So if you look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, okay, back in 1755, he said the following. So many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious good sense of civilized man. Okay, kind of wordy here, but the main idea is this. Nothing can be more gentle than mankind, and obviously they don't mean man, they mean humankind, than humankind in his primitive state. So the idea that Jean-Jacques Rousseau has is that people are naturally gentle. And what happens is that society and culture makes us aggressive, teaches us how to be aggressive. Okay? But the idea here is that humans are noble savages, in other words. And so this sort of philosophy is captured in the idea of Tarzan, for instance. So Tarzan grows up in the jungle outside of human society, and Tarzan is what the gentle giant or whatever they call him, that he's naturally non-aggressive and sort of good, right? And so this is the idea that aggression is only a learned behavior, and so if you don't expose people to society and culture, then they're not going to tend to be aggressive. So that's certainly one perspective. The other perspective is captured by Thomas Hobbes, philosopher, in 1651, who said the following. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, They're in that condition which is called war. And such a war is as if of every man against every man. Okay. So the idea here is that without a common power to keep them in awe, they are in a condition called war, meaning people are naturally aggressive. They're naturally tending towards war at an inherent natural sense, unless they have a common power to keep them all in awe. That common power would be society, for instance. Okay. So if we're in a society that teaches us to restrain ourselves, then we can inhibit that aggressive urge, but naturally we are aggressive. That's the position that Thomas Hobbes takes. This is obviously the opposite position. And this sort of idea is captured in, for instance, the book, The Lord of the Flies. I'm assuming some people probably have read that book in high school or something. It's often commonly assigned. In the book, Lord of the Flies, it's basically a bunch of boys and their plane crashes on a deserted island. And there's no adults around. I think it's all like 10 or 11-year-old boys. And there's no adults around. And so basically, you've taken boys who've grown up in society, you now remove them from society. And what happens over the course of the book is the boys get more and more violent and aggressive over time as they sort of revert back to their natural inclinations. So the idea here is that humans are naturally aggressive and violent, unless we're in a society that restrains those natural urges. So we're going to look at both of these perspectives. So the first thing we're going to do is look at a couple of different biological theories of aggression. And the first one we'll talk about is one that Sigmund Freud came up with. Now, I should say right off the bat that Freud, who was hugely influential to the field of psychology, but a lot of his theories were not really empirically based, and a lot of them are not really taken seriously today. And this is one of them. So no one really believes this theory today. Okay, so keep that in mind. But for historic purposes, I wanted to just mention it. So his idea, according to Freud, people have not only a motivation to stay alive, but they also have a death instinct, sort of this inherent motivation to be dead or to be still. Now, because we also have a life instinct, though, the life instinct battles the death instinct and it makes sure that we don't just kill ourselves most of the time. Freud would have said, though, that people who commit suicide, it's because their death instinct got too strong for the life instinct, and that's why they killed themselves. But what happens with aggression, according to Freud, is that sometimes that motivation to kill yourself, that death instinct, gets deflected outwards towards other people. So when that death instinct is deflected outwards towards others, that results in effectively attempts to kill other people, right? So that results in aggression towards other people. So that's what aggression is, the deflection of the death instinct towards other people. Now, no one really seriously, or takes this theory seriously, no real serious psychologists, but people online, some people believe in this, and I actually found some websites where people believe you can measure your own death instinct by looking at your hand. And if you look at those two parts, the two parts on the base of your hand, if they're not in alignment, that would mean you have a strong death instinct. And if they're sort of more straight, you have a weak death instinct. As I said, this is all nonsense, right? No one really believes this or takes this really seriously. So don't read too much into this. But for historic purposes, I did want to mention it. But a much more popular biological theory of aggression is the evolutionary theory of aggression. So I want to briefly discuss that. Now, remember, I think it was last week when we talked about attraction, or whenever we talked about attraction, I sort of briefly introduced the idea of evolutionary theorizing for psychology. The basic idea is that if we have a gene that leads us to be more likely to survive and reproduce, then we'll pass on that gene to our offspring, and that gene will spread through the population over generations. And so what that means is that if there was some sort of gene, if we have some part of our genetic code that leads us to be aggressive, then it must be the case that aggression evolved because it helped our ancestors to survive in the past. So for instance, let's sort of rewind the clock a couple 100,000 years, right? Let's go to our evolutionary ancestors. Let's imagine that in this group of our evolutionary ancestors, there are some people who had the gene for being aggressive and some people who didn't. And so the people who had the gene for being aggressive, they would go out, they would hunt, they would kill animals, they'd have meat to eat, right? They'd be able to survive because they had that meat. Our ancestors who didn't have that gene for being aggressive, because they weren't aggressive, they didn't hunt. They didn't hunt, they didn't have meat. They didn't have meat, they starved to death. So therefore, they couldn't pass on that gene for being passive, right? So what that means, or I guess according to evolutionary theory, what that means is that we are genetically inclined to be aggressive in part because those genes helped our ancestors survive hundreds of thousands of years ago. Okay? That's the basic idea behind the evolutionary theory of aggression. Now, that being said, there's a whole lot of sort of intricacies involved in this as well. So for instance, if we look at humans, we notice that there are sex differences in aggression. So we know that, for instance, men tend to be much more, or I should say, men tend to be more aggressive than women on average. Carolina, in response to your question, so couldn't the same argument be made for kindness and generosity? Yes, it can. And some people have made that argument, that in fact, there could be an altruistic gene, right? Because altruism and kindness and generosity could also have helped us to survive in the past. And so therefore, we could have those genes as well. And those genes could sort of live beside one another. And by the way, I'm drastically oversimplifying how genetics works. So don't take this too literally. You'd have to go through like multiple genetics classes to really dig into this. So I'm kind of, is sort of metaphorical and sort of an oversimplification. But yes, you could technically, sure, have genes for kindness and generosity or altruism, things like that. So within humans, we know that men tend to be more aggressive than women. And we also know that there are differences in terms of strength on average between men and women, and size. Men tend to be taller than women. And you can look at these sort of sex differences across different species as well. And it's not universal. There are some species where the females of the species are larger and more aggressive than the males. But there are a lot of species, there are probably more species where the males are more aggressive than the females. And so this suggests that the reason for why the males are more aggressive than the females across species and humans as well could be due to some sort of genetic factor, some biological factor. So let's look at this a little bit. The basic idea is this, and I can't get into this too much because I just don't have the time. But for various reasons, we know that women, human women, and as well as females in other species, but human women tend to be more selective in terms of their sexual partners than men, human men are. Okay. There's a bunch of reasons for this that all have to go back to gestation and things like that, but I don't have time to get into this. But if we assume, so we take that as a given, that women tend to be sexually choosier than men on average, okay? What that means is that men within that species have to compete with one another in order to gain sexual access to females. Now, I'm using sort of evolutionary language, so it might sound weird to say that men compete for sexual access to women. That's not really how it works today, but I'm talking about in like animal species and things like that, that the males of a species tend to have to compete with one another for access to females. And that competition can often become very violent and aggressive. Like the males will often fight sometimes to the death in certain species, and only the winner gets to mate with the females. And so what that means is that only the strong, aggressive males are ever able to mate with the females and therefore pass on their genes for having strong, aggressive males. If you have males of species who are weak and passive, they don't win those fights. If they don't win the fights, they're never able to mate. They can't pass on their genes for being weak and passive. As a consequence, the idea is that in any species in which the females are choosier than the males in terms of a sexual partner, the males will tend to get stronger and more aggressive because they have to compete with one another for access to the females. And so that's why we have this sort of sex difference today where the males are more aggressive than the females, is because the women were choosier. And you can actually see this in other species. So if you look at elephant seals, for instance, this is a male and female elephant seal. The male is the black one, the female is the brown one. And you can see the male is much larger than the female, right? Here's another couple elephant seals. So the big giant elephant seal, the brown one in the middle, that's a male. The one on its left, or our left, its right, our left. The black one, that's a female. And the little one lying right beside the head of the male, that's its little pup, okay? So you can see big sex differences. The males are much larger than the females. And so according to evolutionary logic, in any species where that's the case, the idea should be that the males are larger because the females are choosier sexually, which is true for elephant seals. And the males have to fight one another in order to gain access to mate with the females. And in fact, that's exactly what happens with elephant seals, that these males will often fight to the death in these extremely violent and bloody battles, and only the winners of those fights ever get to mate with the females. So therefore, only the strong, large, aggressive males ever win the fights and therefore mate with the females and therefore pass on their genes for having strong, aggressive males. So as a consequence, if you look over many, many, many generations, the males tend to get larger, bigger, more aggressive, more violent over time. But because the females never have to compete with one another, because they're the choosier sex, there's not the same pressure for them to get stronger and bigger and more violent over time. So as a consequence, if you fast forward many, many generations, you end up with elephant seals where the males are much bigger and more aggressive than the females. And so the same logic applies for humans, not quite to the same extent as elephant seals, but the same logic would still apply, is that the males would tend to compete with one another for access to the females, which puts pressure on them to get stronger and more aggressive over time. Okay, that's the idea. There's also other evidence that's consistent with evolutionary reasoning as well. So for instance, some studies have shown that if you look at the rates of child abuse, especially fatal child abuse, and you look at those rates for biological parents versus step parents, that children living with step parents are something like 70 to 100 times more likely to be fatally abused, to be killed by their step parents, than children living with both biological parents. Now, just to be clear, that does not mean there's a huge chance of being killed by a step parent. Those rates are still pretty small, right? But even those small rates are 100 times more likely than being killed by a biological parent, which is incredibly rare. And the idea, of course, is that let's say that I have a gene and my gene says or leads me to want to kill my kids. I'm never going to be able to pass that gene on, right? Because I'm going to have kids who have that gene and then I'm going to kill them. So that gene's never going to be passed on. It'll die with me. If, on the other hand, I have a gene that says, love your kids and make sure they're safe and make sure they survive, so I take care of my kids, well, that ensures my kids survive, and that gene that I passed on to them, they're going to be able to pass on to their own offspring, right? And so what that means is, according to the evolutionary theories, we should tend to be really genetically inclined to love and take care of our offspring, which, of course, we tend to be. But step parents don't have that same gene for their kids, right? A step parent could theoretically have some sort of gene that leads them to be aggressive towards non-genetic relatives, and that gene could survive, right? That gene could still be passed on through their own offspring. Okay. The point is that there is this evolutionary theorizing which suggests that we might be biologically inclined to behave aggressively in some situations. So that's the main biological theory of aggression. There are also a bunch of learned theories of aggression as well. And there certainly are empirical findings that are hard to explain without having some sort of learned theories of aggression. And the studies I want to talk about briefly are sort of based on this idea. There are different subcultures around the world that are known as being cultures of honor. In these subcultures, honor, your reputation, is a very important part of who you are. And within these cultures, if your honor is impugned, or in other words, if someone insults you or harms your reputation, then within these subcultures, people are taught to restore their reputation by harming or being aggressive against the person who damaged their reputation. In fact, we have one of these subcultures of honor within this country. Typically in the southern United States, the South is considered to be a culture of honor. So the South in the US would include places like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, a lot of those places. Northern Florida would count as the South. We're in southern Florida, so this is not part of the South, which is kind of weird. It's the only part of the country where you have to go north to get to the South. But northern Florida would count as the South. Now, the basic idea, as I mentioned, is that within these subcultures of honor, within the South, they have learned that your reputation matters a lot. And therefore, if someone harms your reputation, you need to restore your reputation, often by harming that person. And so some researchers wanted to test this idea. Okay, they wanted to see if people from the South really had this culture of honor. So they set up an experiment where they had college students who were all men for various reasons I won't get into, but the participants were all male college students. And they had them sign up for a study. And in order to get to the room where the study was being held, they had to go down this really narrow hallway. Okay? So imagine that this participant's walking down this really narrow hallway. And prior to getting to the door, the room where the experiment is, There's a filing cabinet. There's a guy at a filing cabinet there. And he's got the filing cabinet open in the hallway. And the only way you can get around them is if he closes the filing cabinet. So as you approach him, he sees you coming. And he kind of says, "Oh, God, I can't believe this." And then he closes the filing cabinet sort of begrudgingly, and you pass him. Okay. And you go into this room. That's going to be important later. So you get into this room, and the experimenter meets you there. And he says that as part of this study, you've got to go to this other room down the hall, and you've got to give a saliva sample and things like that for various reasons. So you leave the room, and again, you've got to pass by the same guy who's at the filing cabinet. And he sees you again. And this time, when you pass him, he kind of shuts the door really angrily. And as you pass by him, he bumps into you with his shoulder. Okay. And then right when he bumps into you, he looks at you and he says, "You asshole." That's what happens. Now, at this point, you're faced with one of a couple options. People usually react in one of two ways. Either they get really angry back at this person, right? Like, "You're calling me an asshole? You're the one that's an asshole," right? Or they kind of give them like a laugh, like, "Who are you? Like, what are you talking about?" It's kind of like almost like a joke to them, right? So these participants will respond in one of those two ways. And it turns out that there's another student who's sitting in that hallway who's pretending to take notes, but in fact is working with the experimenter. And their whole role is to note your face when you turn back at this person who called you an asshole, and note whether you're angry or whether you're more amused at it. Okay. So we'll come back to that in a second. So you go to the second room, and in the second room, the researcher takes a saliva sample, and what they're really looking for is they're going to measure things like your adrenaline levels and your testosterone levels, and basically hormone levels that are associated with anger. When you get to that room, you're also greeted by an experimenter who shakes your hand, and that experimenter notes how hard you shake that person's hand. They're going to make a mental note of that. And then you've got to engage in some tasks. So for instance, the experimenter says that to finish the following story. So remember, these are all men. So they say, imagine you're at a party with your girlfriend. And during the night, your girlfriend comes to you and complains that this guy, Bob, has been hitting on her all night, and she's really annoyed. And sure enough, you look over 5 minutes later, and there's Bob hitting on your girlfriend. Now finish the story. What do you do? Now, what the researchers are really interested in is whether being bumped by that guy in the hallway, who would that something that would harm your reputation or harm your honor to some degree, whether that will affect people from the South differently than people from the North. Okay. In particular, the idea is that people from the North should tend to kind of laugh off the fact that this guy bumped into them because they're not from this culture of honor. Whereas people from the South should feel like they've just been insulted and should want to get revenge and should tend to behave more aggressively, which is basically exactly what they showed. So what they showed is that people from the North, when they were bumped, they tended to respond with a look of amusement to this guy. And they don't really show a whole lot of signs of aggression later on. People from the South, on the other hand, when they get bumped by this person, they tend to look back at them with this like angry look in their eyes. When they get to the next room, when they greet the experimenter in the next room, they tend to like violently, strongly shake his hand. They tend to show elevated levels of testosterone and adrenaline, which are related to aggression. When they're given this story to fill out, they tend to respond with Bob hitting on your girlfriend. They tend to respond that they beat the crap out of Bob. Okay. In other words, they tend to get much more aggressive following this bump. But the reasoning being that because they're from a culture of honor, they've learned that you've got to respond to people who insult you with aggression. And then my favorite part of the study is that after they're done in that second room, they start walking down the hallway, that narrow hallway again. And as they're walking down this narrow hallway, someone comes from around a corner and starts walking directly at them. Okay. Now, basically, that person's working with the experimenter, and they've been told to walk straight at the participant and to not deviate, just walk straight at them. Okay. And the researcher wants to know whether participants will get out of the way of this person or not. And what typically happens is that among people from the North, they get out of the way pretty soon and let this person pass. But from people from the South, they walk right up to this person to like face to face and only then get out of the way. The idea being that because these people from the South have just been insulted a few minutes ago, they've got to restore their reputation, their honor, which they do by being really aggressive and manly kind of thing, right? And so they're not going to get out of the way of someone. They're trying to dominate this other person. So basically, what these studies show is that this subculture of honor exists in people from the South, Southern US, in which they're taught that if their reputation is damaged, they have to restore it by being aggressive. Okay, so it's consistent with this idea that we can learn to become aggressive. Okay, I'm going to end things there. But before I let you go, we are going to have a quiz. So let's open your top hat. This is quiz number 12, I think. Okay, so these are 5 questions that all have to do with aggression, everything we've talked about today. So let's get started. All right, so the first question has to do with the operational definition that we talked about. So, true or false? In order for social psychologists to call an action aggressive, the person being aggressed against must be aware of the action. Is that true or false? I'll give people a few extra seconds in case you're still opening top up. Okay, and you got 10 seconds to answer. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked about the 4 components of the operational definition for aggression, and being aware of the action is not one of those components, which makes the answer false. Question number 2. A criminal who punches someone in order to steal their wallet is using which kind of aggression? Relational, instrumental, learned, or vicarious? Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, now obviously if physical was an option, we could have selected that because that would be an example of physical aggression, but physical is not an option, so it's got to be something else. And so we talked about the differences between hostile aggression and instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression is using aggression for some other end. And so a criminal who punches someone in order to steal their wallet is using aggression in order to get the wallet. So that would be an example of instrumental aggression. Question 3. Social psychologists distinguish between physical aggression and what other kind of aggression? Emotional, relational, affective, or vicarious? 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we differentiated between physical aggression and relational aggression. Relational aggression is aggression that attempts to harm other people's relationships with other people. All right, question, what is this for? Evolutionary theory postulates that sex differences in aggression, so for instance, the fact that males tend to be more aggressive than females, is ultimately the result of which of the following? A, cultures of honor in which males are taught to respond to provocation. B, females being choosier when picking a sexual partner than males. C, different socialization practices for girls and boys. Or D, females being more interdependent than males. We've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked about in evolutionary theorizing that the logic is that if females are choosier when picking a sexual partner than males, then that means the males have to fight one another for access to the females. Only the strong, aggressive males ever win those fights, and therefore only the strong, aggressive males are able to mate and pass on their genes for having strong, aggressive males. So therefore, B is the correct answer. We talked about cultures of honor for A, but we didn't talk about how that's related to evolutionary theory. That's separate from evolutionary theory. And finally, question 5. Oh, wait a sec. We didn't get to this one yet. Okay, so guess what? You get to be told the correct answer. I'll just tell you what it is, and you get a free point for this one. I thought we were going to get this far, and we didn't get this far. So as we will see in Thursday's class, there's something called social learning theory. D, that's the correct answer. That's what you should pick, which talks about how we learn to become aggressive by watching other people be aggressive. And we'll expand upon that a little bit more on Thursday, so you'll see why that's the case. But for now, just select option D and you will get the point. So you only got a few seconds to do that. All right, you got 3 seconds to select option D. 2, 1. Okay, so as I said, we will talk about that next class. Okay, so I will be, as I said, I will be giving assignment 3 next class. So make sure that you are either here in class next class or that you check on Canvas at some point after Thursday's class. When I will post the assignment, it'll be due the following Thursday. All right, thanks guys. I will see you on Thursday. Have a good day.